If you're into the horror genre, you've probably seen the movie Alien by Ridley Scott. A quintessential film of the genre, Scott's masterpiece introduced the world to the works of H.R. Giger. Combining the biological and mechanical, Giger created one of the most terrifying creatures that's ever graced the silver screen, and his influence over the world design of the xenomorphs is something that has continued with the Alien franchise even to the modern day. Even in the Prometheus films, we still see that Giger's influence carries over into almost all of the design decisions of that universe. As a fan of the Alien franchise, I knew from first glance that I had to play Scorn when I first saw the footage of it a couple years back. It looked generally disturbing, and I thought to myself, that's Prometheus as a survival horror game. Say what you like, the lore of the Alien world is extremely interesting, even if the most recent films could have been better. And I was hoping that Scorn could tick off all of those boxes for me. And it did, sort of. Much like the film Prometheus, Scorn does a great job of presenting interesting ideas and creating a truly disturbing world that will leave an impression on you. However, I feel like the story could have been used to a much greater effect in a different medium. Now let's talk about why. Hey everybody, this is LittleBobby with 59 Direct, and today we're going to be discussing Scorn by Ebb Software. Scorn has been on a lot of people's radars for years, having initially been pitched with a Kickstarter as far back as 2014. And while there have been updates throughout the years, there hasn't been anything super concrete until about 2 years ago when this game was finally announced to be released in 2021. However, due to worldwide conditions, the game was inevitably pushed back with one final delay into 2022. With the release finally here, I was super excited to get my hands on this one, and I will tell you right now, this is not a game for everyone. Let me start off by saying that Scorn looks incredible. I'd wager that 90% or more of the development time for this game was spent on crafting and perfecting the world itself. Everything here draws from the works of H.R. Giger and Polish artist Zacław Beksinski, with everything in the game having a biomechanical look that is straight out of hell. If you're a fan of either of these two artists, I'd absolutely recommend playing through Scorn once based off the visuals alone. I mean, just look at this. With this art style, it's clear that Scorn is something for fans of hellish horror visuals. Everything in the game is disturbing, with gore and viscera present throughout. There's a visual style here that never quite looks so good in the medium of gaming, and the world feels both dead and alive at the same time. The biomechanical aspect makes you feel like you're wandering around the ship from Alien or Prometheus. While it's clear that everything is a machine, everything looks wet or slimy, and there's also an uncomfortable level of sexuality to the design of just about everything. Every corridor and opening looks like an orifice. You insert your fingers, hand, or your pneumatic gun to interact with everything. All of this is meant to make you feel uncomfortable with the world and your interactions. We tend to shy away from sexuality and social culture, especially those of us raised in the United States, and I predict that Ebb knew that Americans would have the desired response to this onslaught of quasi-sexual imagery. This really comes to a head in the last part of the game when you enter the area known as Polis. The area is adorned with multiple depictions of people engaging in sexual interactions that are so explicit that we can unfortunately not show them to you here on YouTube. However, it begs a question as to why the seemingly highest part of this facility that we've been trying to navigate is so obsessed with reproduction. Side note, almost none of this is presented in-game to the player, and I had to learn the name of this place by looking into the art book that was sold alongside the game at release. We'll talk more about that later. Another one of the standout features of Scorn is the ambience created while playing through with the lack of music and the incredible sound design. If you want the best possible experience of Scorn, you need to find a set of solid headphones and play in the dark. The sound design in this game is some of the best that I've ever experienced in a game. You're going to hear sounds of the environment creaking, the disgusting noises of the creatures you come across, and the wet sounds of any of the machinery that you interact with. The sound in this game is fantastic at reinforcing that you're in an alien world. It's one of my favorite things outside of the visuals. But this is going to bring us to talk about the story part of the game. As it stands, there isn't really a story that's clearly presented to the player. There are incredibly limited cutscenes, no dialogue, and even extremely minimal music. In fact, the only time I really remember noticing any music was during the very end of the game. And as someone who grew up paying attention to game music, I found this decision very appropriate for Scorn as a whole. But onto the story itself. From what I can gather, you play as two protagonists. The first act of the game is an introduction to the first protagonist who tries to find their way out of a facility. After sacrificing a creature that they free from an egg, they end up seemingly dying after a machine explodes and they are trapped in a type of foam that smothers them and attaches them to the ground. That's when you wake up as the second protagonist, who you play for the remainder of the game. The second protagonist wakes up from some sort of egg outside in the harsh landscape and makes their way through to a large facility. As you go through the facility, you find yourself treading over the same spaces that the first protagonist came through during Act 1, but clearly decades or even centuries later. As you move through the facility, you find a tool that allows you to interact with the environment. You solve different puzzles on every level. Act 2 involves a type of bio key letting you free some humans from a pod before moving further into the facility. Act 3 involves using cages to navigate the environment and reach a higher level, and also unfortunately introduces combat. Act 4 sees you navigating a maze around a giant, horrifying, yet surprisingly motherly creature. And Act 5 involves reaching Polis and trying to escape the facility through a portal that seems to lead to some sort of ascendant plane. All the while, you're literally being torn apart by a parasite that attaches to you early on in Act 2. It's revealed near the end of the game that the parasite is actually a mutated version of our character from the first act, and it ends up being the thing that prevents us from reaching the portal to the higher plane at the very end of the game. There's obviously a lot that can be taken from this game as presented, but I'd much rather hear your interpretation of the story in the comments, because there are several ways this game could be taken by what was presented here. Now, there is a more formal explanation if you are interested in that in the Art of Scorn book that I mentioned earlier. Everything I've seen from that book, and I've seen a lot. I've seen scans of it. I've seen YouTube videos on the contents. It presents a very clear picture of how this world works and all that. And I do wish a little bit of that was more clearly presented in the game. I don't know how they could do it and keep the same ambiance, but that would be something for them as the developers to figure out. Overall, though, it is a fantastic presentation, and there's definitely one or more artistic interpretations of the story in the game that I've seen in quite a while. I'd actually love to learn more about this world, so much that I'm tempted to buy the book and learn the lore and really be able to dig into all of it. I also wouldn't mind at all if there was some sort of follow-up, either a DLC or a sequel if the game does do well enough in terms of sales. But if they do that, they would really need to do something about the gameplay. The biggest problem with Scorn lies in its gameplay. Look, I get that it's a stylized horror game filled with grotesque stuff that people undoubtedly spent countless hours on over almost a decade, but I don't feel that that excuses the overall sluggish feeling of the controls, movement, and even the puzzle elements. The first major puzzle involves you moving around egg-like objects across a panel on a wall. The puzzle is a little difficult, but the time it takes to complete revolves almost exclusively around how long each piece has to be individually grabbed and slid into a different slot across this rather large puzzle space. Each piece being individually grabbed and slid into a different slot with this crane machine arm thing that moves so slowly. And it's not just this. Every element of almost every puzzle in the game is slow. Right after solving the slide puzzle, you're greeted with this character who you are forced to help escape either by sacrificing it or forcing it into a position where it has to help you. If you choose not to sacrifice it, you have to wait as it slowly follows you throughout the corridors, with the game going so far as to force you to pick it up because it falls over. Now, sure, I get it. This is like a newborn creature thing, but like, come on, it's a game. Like, we don't need the thing to fall over like 4 times on the way to get it to where we can solve the puzzle with it. That's a little much. Now, you might think this is like a methodical, like survival horror slow thing, but I don't think though. I think that Ebb was just really proud of their work, and they wanted to make sure that you spend as much time as possible looking at every little bit of this world. I've already said that this world is gorgeous. It's one of the greatest things I've seen in a video game ever in terms of world design. But as someone who will take their time with like a game when they're reviewing it, even going so far as if a game is short to do 2 playthroughs, it just made it so incredibly dull to play my second playthrough of this game. I already knew how to do the puzzles, so it was literally just being forced to wait as the animations played out, because due to Scorn's extremely short runtime, you'll complete a second playthrough in around 3 hours, and I would say at least an hour and 10 minutes of that is you just waiting for things to happen. But waiting mindlessly for puzzle animations to play was a godsend compared to having to engage in combat. Scorn might have the worst FPS combat in a few gaming generations. I don't remember more underwhelming combat in a shooter since the Xbox 360 PS3 days. And the real problem lies with engagement spaces. Almost every combat space is a tight corridor, which means that if you're caught unawares, you'll probably die. It's a survival horror, so that's good, right? You should be punished for fighting head on, maybe. Well, not really. See, at Scorn, enemies are actually fair and pretty easy once you get used to them. It really just turns into a game of baiting them when you know where they come from. 2 of the 3 main enemies have a ranged attack that will take some decent chunks of your health. The little chicken guys will hit you no matter what you do about 80% of the time. They have incredible accuracy and run away to keep you at range since they have almost no lunge distance from their attacks. If you hide behind something though, they will try to follow you and then find line of sight to shoot you again. Same thing with the medium-sized enemies, except these guys have the accuracy of someone with mud in their eyes. Their accuracy being so bad that if you simply strafe to the left or the right, you'll avoid getting hit by them about 99% of the time. And that's not to mention that you can just kite them in front of any obstacle and they won't be able to shoot or lunge at you, which renders them easy cleanup for any one of your weapons. You do get multiple weapons in Scorn, starting with the pneumatic gun that we mentioned earlier. It's kind of your basic melee weapon and what you use for most encounters with enemies. You can also get a pistol and a shotgun later, but the ammo is so limited that you want to use the pneumatic gun for anything you can. Besides that, the only time you're really going to need the pistol or the shotgun ammo is for the largest basic enemies. These guys are kind of unfair in that if you get hit by them once, they stagger you so much and can basically stun lock you, knocking you down. And they time their attacks so that right when you get up, they're knocking you down again, basically leaving you defenseless. And if you get hit by these guys once, it's over. There's not really much chance of recovery. Maybe if you're lucky and they somehow get locked into place for an extra second, like their animation cycle doesn't start again immediately, you might be able to get away. But overall, these guys, like if they get you and hit you down, it's over. You're about to restart from your last checkpoint. And so when you inevitably do die to those guys, what you're going to do is you're going to memorize exactly where they came from when you died to them, and you're just going to be there waiting with your gun. You're going to know to have it out, and you're going to just shoot them with as many shots as it takes to get them down. It just, again, is not much of an enjoyable combat experience because once you shoot them once, then they get stun locked. So you just kind of shoot them, and then they're dead, or they hit you, and you're dead. Combat in Scorn is a lot of just memorizing spawn locations and routes of enemies, and it's one of the things that makes Act 3 and 4 take much longer than they realistically should. The combat in Scorn is abysmal, and I really wish they just left it as an atmospheric puzzle game because I feel like the game would have been better for it. Instead of creating these enemies and finding places to put them to try and spring a surprise cheap death on players, make traps and other hazards that players have to navigate, really lean into the alien world itself being the danger instead of these creatures that are just monotonous to fight over and over. Keep in mind, Scorn also has no map, and the game design wasn't exactly forthcoming in helping you find your way around. The game does have an old school feel in that regard, which is not going to be for everyone. I think I mentioned that at the beginning. You must commit to memorizing things you've interacted with and which ways that you've already gone. On the footage from my second playthrough, which is what's being used here, you can see I went to great lengths to memorize as much as I could after the first playthrough, since I spent a good amount of time just wandering around trying to figure out where the hell I was. You get no objective markers, no map, and nothing in the world is designed to really guide you anywhere. This is actually okay with me, but I could see a lot of people who didn't play puzzle games in the 90s getting frustrated with this very, very quickly. Scorn had decent performance, but not the best. There's an NVIDIA driver released the day the game came out, which helped me a bit on my second playthrough, but the game still wasn't terribly well optimized. There were lots of times where I noticed noticeable frame dips. There are even a few points that our editor will probably be able to look through and put in for you to see here. But I did test this on a 3080 with a Ryzen 5900X processor, and sure, this combo is going on like 2 years old, but it runs just about everything on high with no problems. I can only assume that this world is completely modeled and textured with all of the fine details included in the full render of everything. That's the only reason I can think of for a game this size to be so taxing, especially in spaces that generally aren't very large. Now, that driver update did certainly help a bit, but not enough to combat these performance issues entirely. Overall, I'd say the performance was decent, nothing stellar, but certainly better than something like Anthem when that first released. One other thing, I did play this on Game Pass, and I had this weird bug that I've gotten only on other Game Pass games. The game or Game Pass itself just like loses your license. And yeah, I know this has happened to me on PS4 too back in the day, but I haven't seen this for a long time. But it lost my license somewhere along the line and I couldn't start the game. I tried all the fixes online and nothing worked. And I assume this had to do with Microsoft account permissions or something, because some of the fixes I tried involved signing out of Game Pass or signing back into the Microsoft Store, right, or resetting the cache. But it ultimately ended up with me having to uninstall and reinstall the game entirely. So if you'd like to save yourself the hassle, a copy from Steam might be better. As the title of this review says, Scorn is great as art. I was enthralled during my first playthrough and I took my time and took everything in. However, as a game, it's lacking the things that make games enjoyable. Difficult navigation combines with slow and frustrating gameplay to create something that isn't pleasant. If it wasn't for the fact that I was so enamored with the world itself, I likely wouldn't have even gone for the second playthrough for my review. However, if you think you're fine with the negatives and you're a big fan of the aesthetic of Scorn, then I highly recommend a playthrough. The world that Ebb Software created here is really like nothing that's ever been quite so developed in the video game medium, and I really want to know more about this universe. Hopefully, if there is a sequel, they stick with the puzzles and give us more actual information as to what's going on in this world and how things got to be the way they are. Especially since it's clear that the developers had so many more ideas that seem to have fizzled out over the years between the trailers they released, and the art book is really supposed to fill in a lot of the gaps, and that's why it accompanied the game release. But that's really all I've got to say about Scorn. What did you think of it? It certainly was a leap, and it's something that I'm glad Xbox was able to get. As a whole, Microsoft needs to focus on things like this and get more developed in the future from studios like this. If they can get more experimental titles like Scorn and bring this kind of vision to a grander scale, they can really do wonders with their ability to compete in the market, I think. Great world, Ebb. Hope next time we see something for you, you've got it more ironed out, because I think you're on the edge of creating something game-changing here. And while I didn't think it worked with Scorn quite all the way, I could see this universe being expanded on and some better gameplay choices being made to make this franchise something to pay attention to, pending the game does well enough. But I do want to thank you so much for watching the 5/9 Direct review of Scorn. Keep your eyes out, as we'll soon be taking dives into A Plague Tale Requiem, as well as a look into the upcoming live service looter, The First Descendant. So make sure you subscribe for more news, reviews, and all other content we put out here on 5/9 Gaming Direct. Hope you enjoyed this review, and we hope to see you soon.